Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the new SIMGOT E100P, which is also called the Shark. And I think before again, I do want to say that a lot of what my attraction to the set is really the shell and how tiny and weightless it is. It's just a really well done shape, very lightweight resin, very comfortable. I think they pretty much nailed this, and I'm very much looking forward to the metal version of this, which will possibly be a little weightier, but I think I do actually dig the shape of it, and I think it's just really well done, something different. I think if it was a big chunky resin shell like a typical looking IEM shell, I don't know if it would got as much attention as it did right off the bat. But here's the cable, kind of nice looking 2-core cable, kind of not all that far from what you would expect from a $19 set, so I think they actually nailed that pretty well. Plus, they give a right angle 3.5 millimeter, which is always super handy to have handy. So let's kind of jump into it, and I will say this one has been a little divisive, right? But divisive in a good way. I think people either really, really like it or they just like it, and I think I would put myself in the latter category. I think I just kind of like it. It's okay. I think it has a lot of good attributes, and we'll go through a lot of those. But I think for me, it's just really the safe one. It's just a really safe, likable, general appealing tuning. And if you're into the SIMGOT EA500 or their house sound, this is kind of an easier on your treble sensitive ears version of the EA500 sound. A bit more fun to it, a bit of a sub-bass boost to it, but mostly they just took a little brightness out of it, so it sounds a little fuller and the bass is a little more present. If it sounds too lean, you probably have the wrong tips, or you have a bad fit. So here's kind of what the graph looks like on this guy compared to the EA500, and you can kind of see this little, the E100P is in blue, and you can kind of see this 2 dB sub-bass boost, which if you remember my review of the EA500, I said that is probably a good thing to have. Then it actually drops the mid-bass slightly, and I'll kind of explain where that came from, and EA500 actually left that up, and I think that's fine too. I think EA500 just had the brightness out here, so I think that makes perfect sense. Right here in the lower treble pin gain area, kind of similar, not all that far apart. You can see E100 actually bumped it up a little bit, probably because they have a little more here and they have a little less here. So again, I think that is a trade-off, and it all balances out as well. And I think the bigger difference between the two is right out here, where EA500 is not so much super bright, but it just has a pretty high treble presence. And I think that was not as entry-level friendly as something like the E100P, which brought that level down. I think it's just easier going, a slightly more relaxed, a slightly more bass present version of this SIMGOT house tuning. So again, I think it's very likable, very well done. If on the other hand, you're more used to or familiar with Moondrop's Chew or 7Hz Zero, this is a slightly mid-bass boosted version of that, just a kind of a safer version of that, more generally appealing, and the change from Zero is just a little bit less intense than Chew, but keeping that boost slight, it just it's noticeable without really hurting the mids, and it's actually a pretty good trade-off. So this is what I was sort of talking about, where it looks like this is, and the E100 is in red this time, so where it looked like that was actually lower than EA500, is actually above both 7Hz and Chew, and I think, again, that is a sort of a brilliant move. I think that's what was really missing to be a mass market, general appealing version of that tuning. I think people thought generally that one was just, it didn't cover as many genres as it probably could with just a slight boost to it, and that's exactly what E100P does. And again, I think there's just a brilliant move there to put just a little more bass there to make it, just a little bit more fun, but keep this part pretty much the same as both of those sets, and just a little boost here and kind of a little bit of a relax here. This kind of is a little more present in the music. Again, that just fits a little more genres. It's a little more entry-level friendly, a more generally likable sound, not as technical or analytical, not as sharp, not as intense. You kind of get the feel for where E100P kind of sits in this family of sets here. It's just the more relaxed brother of the family. And I think it's just very well done that they picked that route, and I think they executed it pretty well. Also, that female energy, the right female energy. Again, I think this tuning, why part of it was so popular with the market at the time, was it handles female vocals really, really well. And those tend to be globally, I think there's just more female singers and more music that has female tracks. And I think that tends to promote sets that do that very well. I think those get more attention than sets that do male vocals. The ones that do male vocals well, I think they tend to be okay. I think people find them interesting, but if you can't do female vocals right, then you're probably going to have a tougher time with that sale. And I think, again, like I said, E100P kind of does that female energy quite well. And as I said, the whole package is just very entry-level friendly. That price, $19, weightless, tiny shells, that cable, very likable sound, all that stuff just feeds into a very, very nice, likable set for entry-level SIMGOT family and their house sound. A couple of nitpicks on this one. I do think this is another volume-sensitive set. At lower volume, it's very, very safe and not very upper range dynamic. And I couldn't quite dial this one in. It's just that turning it up helps, but doesn't quite tickle your ears with sparkles. I think the upper range is just a little bit too safe. It's certainly not offensive and it's not fatiguing at all, but it doesn't quite take the next step of sounding super extended or airy or any of those other things. It's just kind of well done, very likable, but just kind of a nitpick there. And I think at either volume, kind of related to that, it's just the stage is mostly in your head. You never really get that expansion of the stage, even if you turn the volume up, of where that upper treble sort of rises on the stage. This one kind of stays pretty much between your ears. The sound, like I said, this one is probably one that you've heard before, either through Chu, Zero, EA500, SIMGOT. There's lots of sets that had that same sort of signature. But this one does bring the bass a little bit more into the tuning, which, again, this is just a safer, more pleasing sound to it with a little more bass. Not as lean. Definitely gets you into more genres, which I think is a huge bonus for this guy. The bass, if you're a casual listener, this is definitely better compared to the EA500. If you just want to throw on a set and hit play on your playlist, this one is probably going to sound a little bit better just because of that bass presence. EA500 can be a bit lean, it can be a bit sharp, and I think just giving you that little extra bit there, bringing down the brightness a little bit, simply not as thin. The bass is definitely in the Goldilocks zone, not too much, not too little. It's really just a nice alternative to that sound, like I talked about in that $19 Zoo Chu. EA500 is definitely a better set, but as far as would you give EA500 to your friend who isn't really an audiophile? Probably not. You'd probably stick with the E100. I think this is generally a set you can pretty much give everyone, and they'll be like, oh, that sounds exactly the way I thought it was going to sound, or it sounds better than I thought it was going to sound, without having to worry about whether they have the right source or the right tips and all that. This one is just, very entry-level friendly. So the mids, again, safer, more generally appealing than, say, EA500, but perhaps too safe in resolving details if that's really high on your priority list. Again, it's just tuned in a different way. It's a more casual, more relaxed listen. If resolving detail is really high on your priority, probably not going to be a set for you. And I think even this one is more casual, more general appearing, like I said. I think most people prefer the balance in the mids, again, because it's just likable. But if you're chasing those details, probably Zero or Chu might be along the same lines on the signature, but a little more detailed, a little more analytic, and a little bit sharper to get those details teased out of that driver. The sense of lower dynamics and clarity and transparency is partly affected by the volume. Like I said, this one behaves a little differently at lower volume and at higher volume, but it's also a little bass related. I think they added a little bit of mid bass there. And in that signature, I do think it actually makes it just a little bit harder to tease out this clarity and transparency. And I sort of struggled with that bit of how do you make it sound come alive a little bit, like I talked about with Legato. Legato had this almost binary point on volume where you just click it and suddenly it projects out and everything sounds a little bit sharper and clearer. And with this one, I think I just had a harder time trying to figure out where that point would be, and dialing it up too much, and you end up hitting into the female vocal zone, right? So if you have a little too much volume, this became a little bit too sharp, and that became a little bit less appealing. So yeah, I think generally I just had a harder time, and I understand how so many people really, really like this set, and for me, I just couldn't quite get it dialed in for me to say I really, really like it. It's definitely likable, but the stage for me is also that constant reminder that that upper treble presence isn't quite, it's not quite as airy, it's not quite as big, and that was really just a trade-off for that likable sound. If you do nothing wrong and you just do really solid playback without getting that last 5% done, that's pretty much what this one sounds like, and I think that was a pretty good trade-off for them to make. Treble, kind of like it's Zero and Two Brothers, I think that upper mid, that lower treble, that pinna area, that emphasis where those female vocals are, it really makes it harder to hear the upper treble. I think those sets actually had the same problem. They're not, the air is sort of there, it's just a little bit harder to hear. Again, the volume sort of gets you there, but I think most people will stick with that, with a fuller sound at lower volume rather than push that lower treble into the females and make them a little bit sharper. I don't think too many people are really going to do that on this one. I think they'll stick with that very much at a slightly lower volume and a much fuller sound. Stage, mostly in your head like I talked about, but as a general purpose value set, I think it gets everything else and all the important parts right, and the last bit that you expect to see at EA500 prices, maybe not as well done at E100, but E100 gets sort of the important entry-level, first-time owner, just want to pop this in as a casual listener. I think it gets all those pieces right. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.